Hi, I'm Chip Hardwick. I'm the Synod Executive for the Synod of the Covenant. I want to welcome you to the second session of this webinar that is being put on in partnership with Science for the Church. And I'm grateful for each of you that are here in person now, as well as everyone who will be watching it later online. I want to just tell you about a couple of things going on in the life of the Synod. I won't show any slides because most of you were here last week, but if you want information about our scholarship program, which are available for college students, associate students, and vocational school students, and then first theological master's degree, I'd be glad to give you information about that. I just found out yesterday that our preaching workshop, we won't have one this month in April because of Holy Week, but next month, Craig Barnes, the President Emeritus of Princeton Seminary, is going to lead about caring for the preacher's soul, which should be a great presentation. And we have again a 3-week webinar on clergy loneliness that will be coming up in April. There might be some overlap between what Dr. Wang talks to us today about and what we'll learn there. Let me open us in prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Drew Rick Miller from the Science for the Church, and he can introduce Dr. Wang. So let us pray. Gracious God, thank you so much for the chance to think about issues of mental health, how they connect with ministries of churches, how they connect with leadership of churches, and what we can learn both from theology and from the hard sciences. We're grateful, God, for this chance to reflect, and we put it in your hands. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. So glad to introduce you to Drew Rick Miller. Those of you who were here last week got to meet him. He is the co-leader for Science for the Church. They're a remarkable organization that does something so unique, which is to bring together the hard sciences and theological commitments, faith commitments. And this is the second of a 3-week webinar. If you missed the first week, last week, it's up on our YouTube channel, and I'll put the link in the chat, and you'll have a chance to look at that if you have missed it already. But Drew, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much for your partnership in the gospel and for your friendship, and for introducing Dr. Wang.
Indeed. Thank you, Chip. It's good to be with you all again this week. And I'm real excited to introduce David Wang to you. I've had the privilege of working with him for a number of years now. David recently moved to Fuller Seminary, where he's in the psychology program there. He holds the Cliff and Joyce Penner Chair for the Formation of Emotionally Healthy Leaders. And David's background is pretty remarkable. He has, I think, a computer science undergrad degree, if I remember right, but then he did clinical psychology. He's got a master's in theology. He's done a lot of work on trauma, and he's a licensed psychologist. He maintains to this day a small practice. He also serves as an associate pastor at a wonderful, diverse church in Fullerton, California. And then he travels the world, working with seminaries and churches and a range of groups on the kinds of issues we're talking about today. His particular expertise, if I got it right after these years, David, is particularly in trauma. But then he's also done an incredible amount of work in spiritual formation, including a really neat project, which is where I got to know David, assessing spiritual formation of seminarians. So what happens during our 3 years doing those MDiv programs? Are we formed spiritually or not? It's a real neat program that they've worked with, I think, a couple dozen seminaries, along with the Association of Theological Schools. So he brings this background of clinical psychology, counseling, alongside this work on formation, and is a real gift to Fuller and to the church in helping us to think about how do we create healthy leaders and leaders that thrive in the church. So David, we're thrilled to have you here, and why don't you lead us?
Sounds great. Thanks, Drew, and thanks, Chip, for making this possible. And that was a very generous introduction, and I was wondering about my own emotional health, given all the There's a way to balance all that stuff. It's all really fun, and people are very gracious in all my various roles. And I only see a few people in my private practice on the side. But in any case, I will be drawing from several of those sources in our conversation today on the mental health and well-being of clergy and Christian leaders. And I'd love for our time together to be not just me talking the whole time, but for us to interact. I'd love to hear your reflections, comments, and questions. And I don't mind being interrupted. So if there is a moment or a point that intrigues you, feel free to either unmute yourself and just jump right in. Or ask a question over chat. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the time as well. So what I like to do is just start off by talking a little bit about the impact of COVID on everyone's mental health and well-being. And I know a lot of times pastors, we're people too, so it affects us. But I think for Christian leaders, it affects us both directly as well as indirectly, because when our congregations are struggling, that oftentimes has implications on us on top of what we're going through. Just anecdotally, I remember leading a panel to talk about mental health during COVID about a year ago at the seminary, and we had a panel of 6 individuals, and in each of the 6 individuals that were part of the panel, they had the head pastor of our church had every single one had stepped down in the middle of COVID. So we had 6 head pastor transitions on top of COVID, all within the last 2 or 3 years. And that does seem to be a trend that we're observing from more and more people, although people haven't done the formal research yet. And I'd be curious to hear what it looks like at the PCUSA level as well. So let me start off by saying that, so as Drew mentioned, I'm the Cliff and Joyce Penner Chair for the Formation of Emotionally Healthy Leaders at the Fuller Theological Seminary. So my privilege and honor is to help Fuller rethink what theological education might look like if we were to take seriously the emotional formation, emotional preparation of future Christian leaders, given all the rigors, emotional rigors and challenges that await them. So let me start off by talking a little bit about COVID. So what has been the mental health impact of COVID-19? Here are some, they're not definitive, but here are some hints. Year over year, and this is comparing data from the first year of COVID in 2020, compared to pre-COVID times in 2019, we saw an 8,000% increase in suicide hotline usage. An 8,000% increase. And I would assume that this trend continued into 2021 and beyond. At least among college students, there was a large-scale survey among universities, undergraduate and graduate universities, found that prevalence rates for things like major depressive disorder, it had doubled in 1 year, that anxiety disorders were up 50% year over year from 2019 to 2020. And this wasn't even the end of the lockdowns and the restrictions, right? Research also suggests that quarantine and home isolation was associated with things like anxiety, loneliness, insomnia, decreased concentration, anger, and irritability. And we'll talk a little bit about the anger and irritability in just a few moments. Research from one of the more recent global pandemics, the SARS pandemic, back in 2003, found that about 44% of SARS survivors actually developed post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think the part of this that really sticks out to me is the second half, which says 82% of these individuals who had PTSD are still having PTSD symptoms several years later. So even if, it might be fair to say that a good amount of us, even the majority of us have struggled, but also navigated and survived COVID. For those that really struggled during COVID, there's actually still a large proportion of us that are still feeling its effects even now, even as life is making progress and slowly returning back to normal. The last point I wanted to highlight is the bottom point. We saw a 25% increase in domestic violence calls, a 30% increase in child custody cases, a 24% increase in family disputes year over year as well. And the story behind this is that we're finding that, many of our families have dysfunction. Many of our families have conflict. Many of our families have the potential to be violent. And before COVID, before the lockdowns, before all the additional stress of people losing their jobs, many of us having loved ones losing their lives, that there were already cracks in the armor. And we also learned that having places to work, having schools to attend, they were oftentimes a protective factor for a lot of our families. And when those things, and having churches to attend, I would even add, and when you take those things away and you require families to spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with each other in their home, unfortunately, that oftentimes magnifies the vulnerabilities that already are present. And that potentially leads to things like domestic violence and abuse. And then when you follow that line further, within spiritual communities, within church communities and congregations, who, in addition to the police, who are some of the first people that are called into those situations? That's us, the pastors as well. So on top of all the stuff that that COVID impacted us, we're also dealing with all sorts of increases in crises among our congregation. And sometimes we're called to mitigate and deal with them, not in person, but also over Zoom or over phone call or virtually. So that's kind of a context of just, the magnitude of a lot of the mental health and mental difficulties that just the general population is facing. And what I'd like to do next is share a little bit about some of our research findings on the implications of Christian leaders in particular, from a series of grants funded by the John Templeton Foundation that Drew and I have been working on for the last 7 or 8 years. And the original plan was for us to collect data over 3 years, so longitudinal data from 18 different seminaries. It's ecumenically scoped. So we have the Princeton Theological Seminaries, as well as Virginia Theological Seminary, the flagship Episcopal Seminary, Evangelical Roman Catholic, even an Eastern Orthodox seminary as well, which historically. It's a very, very diverse, over 1,500 students from the very beginning of their MDiv or MA journey to the very end, 6 time points of data from fall of 2019 all the way to spring of 2020. Our original plan was to collect data on spiritual formation, but then COVID happened. And then we found ourselves with some interesting data, such as we have data in the fall of 2019, right before the onset of COVID, and we had data all the way through COVID at the same time. So in our early years on this grant project, we kind of took advantage of this opportunity and looked at pre-COVID behaviors, pre-COVID dispositions, pre-COVID patterns and looked at to what extent are these pre-COVID behaviors and dispositions predictive of how well somebody navigates the mental health challenges imposed by COVID a year and a half later. So what I'd like to do is share some of these findings with you, and not just share them, but really kind of chew through them together, reflect on them together, and get your impressions on them. So if you're open to it, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So let me start off with one snapshot of our fall 2020 data. And these are all data from our 1,500 person sample of seminary students, many of which are already serving in churches, some of which are preparing to serve in churches. We used medical grade mental health outcome instruments, such as the PHQ, which is a measure of depression, And we found that over half of our sample qualified for clinically significant depression. So this isn't just the normal variety of depression that everyone experiences, where we have our up days and down days. These are clinically significant depression that's going to affect and impact your daily living and daily functioning. Over 50% of our seminary sample. About 43% of our seminary sample reported clinically significant anxiety symptoms. And then 43% of our sample reported a traumatic event, experiencing a traumatic, life-threatening event in their lifetime. We actually believe this is underreporting the actual figure. Some of it has to do with people not knowing what a trauma is. And it's very common for people to have survived a trauma, but just not know that that was actually a trauma. But even so, when we actually asked them about the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, we found that 33% of our sample actually endorsed a sufficient number of symptoms to be considered for a full diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So we used a hospital-grade PTSD screener that is typically used in mental health hospitals. And if they pass a certain threshold, that would actually automatically trigger a full psychiatric evaluation for post-traumatic stress disorder. We obviously didn't have that infrastructure, but a third of our participants met or exceeded that threshold. So let me pause here for a moment and see, what do you think? Does this, it was a bit surprising for me. And I would love to hear your initial impressions, if you had any questions, and if you've seen something similar from your perspective on the ground and your perspective from the denomination. So feel free to jump in via chat or unmute yourself and share your thoughts.
I'm actually not that surprised. I actually just graduated seminary last year. So I would have been in the mix of all these people. And I mean, just having been a student through the isolation of COVID, while you're dealing with a lot of theological, issues, and there's also going on with, the Black Lives Matter movement. And there was a lot of depression and anxiety on my campus.
Yes, indeed. And, watching, and I do trauma-informed care work with Black churches throughout Texas, and watching those videos of police brutality, it's a re-traumatization. We cannot do that all the time. We need to be informed, but it's a difficult balance. Yeah.
Do you have data prior to COVID to know how much this is an increase over what seminarians would normally be experiencing, or normally in non-pre-COVID times? That's
a great question. We do have that data. It's not available here, but we should absolutely look into that. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it was already quite substantive, even pre-COVID.
My understanding from my work in pastoral care and neuroscience in seminary is that the rates are higher than the general population, substantially higher than the general population.
Is that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So it looks like
it could be that seminarians are more likely to acknowledge symptomology than the general population. So that has to be, I'm not sure what has been teased apart from that. Seminarians, especially while they're undergoing the seminary process, are in a more reflective and vulnerable state, or are willing to be more vulnerable sometimes than the general population. So
yeah, I'd be curious to jump in, Suzanne.
I had a question and this, I just don't know what the data is for seminary students or pastors in general in terms of like exposure to adverse childhood experiences during those first 18 years of life. I just know, like, for those in the helping fields, nurses, there's really data, pretty strong data, I think, about they oftentimes are they're already dealing with high ACE scores. And I just didn't know if that's true for pastors and seminarians as well. I don't know that data.
Yeah, well, we weren't able to collect ACEs data in the seminary grant, but we did collect ACE data with my Lilly grant, doing trauma-informed care with a cohort of about 25 Black churches throughout the state of Texas. And I actually have slides from that. So that'll be in the second half of our presentation. So I'll talk about the number of ACEs there. I'm hoping to do more targeted research on trauma among pastors and Christian leaders, because, in addition to what Lisa was sharing, I'm suspecting that maybe another factor of, why mental health is more prominent among seminary students is that, perhaps it's that whenever I do training on trauma, on the topic of trauma with Christian leaders, what brings them into the room is this notion of, hey, we have trauma survivors in our church, and let's train you and equip you to care for these trauma survivors in the church. I know you have a heart for them. And then we start actually talking about trauma, and then you can see it in their eyes. There's this shift that goes from, well, I'm here for my church, but I just realized I'm actually here for me, and I'm wondering if, it might be the case that a lot of us actually have our call to ministry is actually shaped by trauma, that, either we had to go through this ourselves, by ourselves, and we don't want other people to do that, or we actually just published a paper on significant emotional, spiritual experiences and vocation and burnout. And I think there's something between those things where it might lead us to a sense of call, a sense of experience, a spiritual experience that might lead us into religious leadership. So there might be something there, but we haven't investigated that formally. I'd also love to hear from others. I mean, what are your thoughts about why it might be the case that seminary students might demonstrate higher levels or prevalence of struggles with mental illness? And if you think this also might be the case for pastors after they graduate.
The other thing I think about after attending seminary, all of us were really there because we were wanting to learn and understand. And there just are so many questions and formation that's going on. And that process itself is it's good. It's just a stressful process. And so I wonder if that's part of what you're seeing too. I don't know.
Yeah, my suspicion is that it's going to be multifaceted. I know the Lilly Foundation has funded this huge initiative on the financial health and well-being of seminaries and seminary students. So I got to do some empirical research on financial stress. I think that's a big part of what's going on among seminary students, because when I was a seminary student, we didn't have much money and it was really stressful, and tuition's not cheap, and it's not like there's these really high-paying jobs waiting for us after graduation. So I think that's certainly part of it as well. We're also seeing some trends in the data that suggest that seminary is also really disorienting from a spiritual perspective. So a lot of people struggle in their faith in seminary, ironically, and some of it might have to do with the fact that you're actually reading other perspectives that you've never considered before, and perhaps for a time you're disoriented and not sure exactly what you believe in. That was certainly the case for me. I grew up in a fairly conservative evangelical institution when I started reading Karl Barth and Moltmann and Bultmann and other people who take their Bible seriously too and take their faith seriously, but had very different conclusions. It's hard to know what to believe, It wasn't just the Sunday school you grew up in. Okay, let's continue. Thank you for that interaction, friends. So the next step in our analysis, we looked at what are pre-COVID dispositions and behaviors. that actually held water in predicting mental health outcomes a year and a half later in the middle of COVID. And this is what we found. We found that the following predicted lower levels of depression 1 year later in the middle of COVID. Humility. We got a whole ton of mileage out of the virtue of humility. Lower depression, lower anxiety, lower burnout, predicted all sorts of stuff longitudinally. And whenever I present this data with different groups of seminaries, people will inevitably ask questions like, well, what are the implications of some of this data? And the first place I will start is we need to get serious about actually cultivating humility, because we graduate quite a lot of students who, know how to exegete the scripture, they know their theology, they got straight A's, but they're really pompous and they're arrogant and and I wouldn't trust soul. I don't know if you can trust soul, the shepherding of souls, to the task of shepherding souls to them. And if we're really serious about preparing future Christian leaders, we have to kind of think and perhaps rethink how we should teach theology, and perhaps do so in a way we're actually cultivating this kind of disposition, because it holds weight, not just in terms of virtue, but also in terms of real life outcomes as well. Forgiveness of others also predicted lower depression. We also got a lot of mileage out of this construct of differentiation of self. It comes from the family systems literature. So if you've worked with marriage and family therapists, this is the theoretical base of a lot of that work. And the notion of differentiation is this sense of, this paradox between, I know who I am. I can, regardless of who I'm related to and what context I live in. And at the same time, I'm really deeply connected with other people. So I belong to a community. I have deep, meaningful, intimate relationships. And I can be close to other people without losing myself. It's kind of that notion. So some facets related to differentiation include things like emotional reactivity, and as well as acceptance of what we cannot change. And differentiation is related to things like Christian nationalism as well, and xenophobia. And to be properly differentiated means that you're not as vulnerable to the kind of the us versus them kind of arguments and mentality. And we actually just published a paper on Christian nationalism and xenophobia, and humility also predicts, it actually decreases our vulnerability for those kinds of things as well. Church attendance and participation also predicted lower depression, understandably, and secure attachment, having secure attachment orientations with loved ones and close ones. What predicted higher levels of depression, on the other hand, and we had some common culprits, experiential avoidance. That was predictive of a lot of negative outcomes, and when I think of experiential avoidance, I think there are many people who are highly religious and who do not engage in avoidance. And those are the individuals that Lisa was talking about earlier. Those people who are on a spiritual journey of being honest with themselves, being vulnerable with themselves and with others, and they're acknowledging their limitations and perhaps some of the areas of growth that they need to engage in. On the other hand, there also are another variety of highly religious individuals that actually use their faith as a means of avoiding their experience, avoiding the reality of themselves, avoiding the reality of the world, of over-spiritualizing, of, we actually just published a paper on prayer, and we looked at the predictive value of prayer on positive and negative mental health outcomes. And we found that the key ingredient that connects prayer and mental health outcomes, or one of the key ingredients, is actually experiential avoidance. So we found that some forms of prayer actually were avoidant kinds of prayer, whereas other kinds of prayer were the opposite of avoidant kinds of prayer. They're the prayers that help us engage in reality. So we found that things like practices like contemplative prayer and was the term of a colloquial prayer, the kind of prayer where you're just talking to God as you're walking down the street informally. Those actually were tied to positive mental health outcomes. And we found that people who engage exclusively in petitionary prayer actually had no predictive value on mental health. And if there was, it was actually negative. And the reason was because it actually encouraged avoidance. So people just ask for things for God as a way to kind of not want to deal with what's in front of them. So, how I would interpret that is, if you've ever met Christians who pray the kinds of prayers that would say, "Oh God, your ways are higher than my ways. Just take this away. Take this away from me. So I don't have to deal with it. I don't have to think about it." And I think the prayer that Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane is much different, where he does acknowledge, "Well, God, take this cup from me if possible, but yet not my will, but your will be done." So there's that second half where it's like, I'm not avoiding reality. I'm actually engaging it. What's another predictor of depression? Shame, avoidant attachment, spiritual struggles. And I'll put a star by the next one, greater self-awareness. I think self-awareness is a good thing on the whole, but sometimes, it might be tough to become aware of what's going on in the self because it's not always pretty. And then there's social disconnectedness. Any thoughts or questions or comments from these findings thus far? What predicted higher levels of depression a year later? What predicted lower levels of depression a year later? And what might be some implications of this on our discipleship work in congregations? What are your thoughts here? Chat or yeah, Nancy, jump in.
What were those also seminary student findings, right? I just
Yes.
wanted to make sure I heard that right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's right.
It's interesting to me to think about how countercultural humility is, and how it's not just absent among us who lead Christian ministries, but also in the culture at large, and how helpful it would be for the culture at large if we were able to, and for ourselves, if we were able to witness to a life of humility and encourage that in the world.
Yeah, thank you. And some of the recent scholars on humility describe and operationalize humility in some really interesting ways. Some people describe humility as having a commitment to an accurate view of oneself. So it's not just about focusing on the negatives, or looking at ourselves kind of in a negative way, but looking at ourselves accurately. And then there's another scholar that talks about humble people are those with quiet egos. And the way you can tell if someone has a quiet ego is if you disagree with them, they don't react. They're not reactive when other people disagree with them or hold different views. I sure wish more churches and Christian communities demonstrated that, especially in the last 3, 4, 5 years. Okay, let's, any other thoughts before we continue?
Dave, I was wondering, I see a lot coming in humility, both in your work and in other places. The other virtue I always hear a lot about is gratitude. Did that come up in any of this as being protective or contributing much?
Good question. We did include gratitude measures, and we did get some results from gratitude, but not nearly as strong as humility in this case. Yeah. So I would absolutely say yes, but perhaps not in the same way. Any other thoughts or questions? And Suzanne, happy to share not only the citations, but I can share the actual articles as well. So I can pass them on to Chip or Drew, and then they can make them available to you all as well.
Yeah, we'll be putting together a bibliography with resources from all 3 weeks. So I'll get some of these links from David and make sure they're included in what we distribute to all registrants at the end, because I know there's a lot we're presenting in all 3 weeks that you're going to want to potentially be able to access later.
And that includes the slides as well. So you'll have a copy of those as well. Yeah. Okay, let's jump back in. So it looks like we're going to end on the at the end of the hour. So I might skip a few slides, and if we have time, we'll go back to them because I do want to go into the trauma data that we talked about earlier. I'll skip these guys. So let me share a little bit from, and this is a smaller sample. We're still in the process of collecting data. About 100 participants from our network of 25-ish predominantly African-American churches in rural as well as urban Texas. Here are some characteristics of the sample we collected. And we'll start with ACEs. We found that, okay, it's not listed here. We should have listed this here. About over 80% of our sample reported at least one ACE. And if I remember correctly, the vast majority of them actually reported more than one ACE. The average was about 3 or 4, in fact. And the most common adverse childhood experience included divorce, separation of parents, a household member was a problematic drinker or used street drugs, and household member was depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide. But the thing that really stuck out to me is that we also, in addition to collecting data on adverse childhood experiences, we also collected data on secondary trauma. So secondary trauma refers to PTSD symptoms that are brought upon indirect exposure to trauma. So you're not actually the one who's experiencing the trauma firsthand, but you're witnessing it, you're engaged in it indirectly, oftentimes as a pastor because you're brought into the crises of your congregation members. And we found that 52% of our sample reported moderate to severe secondary traumatic stress. So this arguably could actually be even worse than our seminary sample, because I think it was about 34% in that sample. And that could be related to the reality that, we've already been exposed to trauma throughout our childhood. In some ways, the seminary experience can be traumatic as well. But when we go into the ministry, we are constantly exposed to trauma through the crises of our church and all our efforts to accompany them and support them in that. And how this is even much more so during this season of COVID. And PTSD was 30%, anxiety was 50%, depression was 40%. So still notable, although the prevalence rates are kind of a little bit different. So now that we've moved from seminarian data to actual Christian leader data, how do these prevalence rates compare to what you observe in your faith communities? And what are the possible implications on the PCUSA and the leadership on the ground and up top within the denomination? Oh, STS stands for secondary traumatic stress. So PTSD symptoms due to indirect exposure to trauma.
So it was 80% of leaders, Black leaders across Texas have had adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah.
I suspect that Black people in general have more ACEs than white people in general in our country. Is that largely true because of the structural racism that they face?
I wouldn't be surprised. And at the same time, the World Health Organization estimates that worldwide, lifetime exposure to trauma is about 80%. So,
Okay, so
and
that
then, yeah, so that's about, right around where the WHO would estimate. And in at-risk urban areas in the United States, that figures closer to maybe 90 to 91%. With exposure to trauma among kind of urban at-risk populations, exceeding those of war veterans and being comparable to those who went through the foster care system. And incarcerated populations are similar as well. And which, again, I mean, for me, it's a clear implication that, in addition to, well, instead, we probably need some reform there, that people are acting out of their trauma and they need mental health support, perhaps more than, what our existing criminal justice system offers. Yeah. Okay, well, let's continue. And we have about 15 minutes, so I'm not sure if we'll get through all of this, but we'll see how far we go. So I also do research on the emotional challenges and emotional wounds that many Christian leaders and ministers face. Some of this is older research, but I don't think things have changed that much and some of the reason why it's older research is because there's not many people who do this kind of research anymore, and hoping to change that under my new role at Fuller. But we find that the number one source of ministry emotional challenges and ministry wounding and of attrition among missionaries, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is attrition among clergy as well, is actually conflict with ministry team members. So it's not even the challenges of working with unreached people groups. It's not just the financial challenges. It's not just the cross-cultural work. It's not just the unrealistic expectations that are placed on pastors and stuff. It's actually not getting along with your fellow pastors and fellow ministry team members. We shoot ourselves in the foot. That is the number one reason, source of stress. A big contributor to ministry team conflict is actually poor mental health and emotional health of ministry team members, with not just major mental illness, but unfortunately, and I wouldn't be surprised if several of us here have encountered something like this, but personality disorders. We're finding that personality disorders, people with personality disorders, and then those don't get vetted out in the hiring process, and they get hired into a pastoral staff that will oftentimes cause disruption and profound broken. There's destruction in the wake when you hire a histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, as well as a borderline personality disorder in the pastoral team. Unfortunately, as a psychologist, I will oftentimes get called in to church situations where, for whatever reason, I think, we probably could imagine head pastor positions, they really attract certain narcissistic personalities. I don't want to infer that most, or even all or most narcissistic personalities, head pastors are narcissistic. I don't want to suggest that at all. But unfortunately, there is a disproportionate proportion. I think the prevalence rate of things like narcissistic personality disorder is about 2%. It's probably higher than 2% among clergy, unfortunately, and it's really destructive to congregations. Some of the work that I engage in and a lot of my fellow psychologists is we do psychological screenings for personality disorders, and stuff like that can be really, really helpful. I've been in cases, but even with psychological screenings, and we might not be able to catch it all the time either. So let me read an excerpt from a fellow psychologist, Dave Wickstrom, who is a member care psychologist and does this full-time as his vocation. And he says this: on rare occasions, and to my chagrin for various reasons, such as countertransference, that's us projecting our stuff onto the people we work with, exceptional faking abilities or defensiveness on the part of the candidate, I had downplayed the data evident on the testing and had mistakenly given the candidate a clean bill of health and a statement of their readiness to move overseas and become a missionary. And there was a time I downplayed a classic borderline personality disorder in one of our tests, psychological tests, the MMPI, because the candidate was so articulate. I found out later they had an IQ in the genius range. I was fooled. Needless to say, that candidate became a missionary and almost destroyed the work and the people on the team. I was able to look back and have determined never to mistrust the data again. I heard a story from a counselor who worked in an overseas counseling center for expatriate workers who saw all members of a local missions team within 6 months. One by one, all the team members were coming, stating that they were burnt out and planned to leave the field. Finally, the last member of the team leader, entered into therapy with the counselor. The counselor soon realized that this team leader had an undiagnosed personality disorder that had been the root cause of all the team conflict that had caused the entire team to leave the field. Sadly, all the team members were so disgruntled and burnt out that this ended their missionary service in less than a stellar way. And I'm sure all of us have heard too many stories just like this. And for me as a psychologist, it's a really solemn reminder that, when we look at this burnout data, I think we should not only respond with, well, let's give people a break, let's support them individually. I think there's a place for that. We should still do that. But sometimes the burnout is a symptom of a larger systemic problem that needs to change in the larger culture of the church. And we might need to do some more investigation into that root cause. Another contributor to poor mental well-being among pastors and Christian leaders is that we oftentimes have a lack of access to safe and confidential spaces. We have no one to talk to about our feelings of being hurt by others, whether we feel burnt out, whether we ourselves have doubts about the faith, or we have problems in our marriage and family. There aren't many spaces for us to talk about that. Recent research from Lifeway Research, the research arm of the Southern Baptists, they looked at burnout among clergy during COVID as well. And they found that if a pastor has just one friend or one context in which they can share vulnerably, that the prevalence of burnout decreased to less than half. So having 0 places to be vulnerable and share versus having just one place actually led to more than a 50% reduction in prevalence of burnout. So I think there's some really important implications here. Being willing to share vulnerably and also having a space to actually do so. And a lot of times there's some good reasons why we don't want to share, because there's fears that we'll be kicked out of our church, of our organization, leave the ministry. We have to be superhuman in order to raise funds and to be seen as a Christian leader. Fears that we'll be judged as lacking in faith or being unfaithful. Fears that we might lose financial support if we're vulnerable and authentic. Fears that those they are ministering to will not become or not want to become Christians. And as a result, we will end up choosing to isolate, hold our pain, and keep going and just kind of press on and chug along, despite further hurt that this may cause to ourselves or others. And this in turn can be tied to things like, fears that we might be a failure as a minister, belief that God cares more about the work than the well-being of his people. This might also come from encouragement from fellow Christians to just keep going on despite trauma, despite family difficulties, despite crises of faith, and again, also fears that Christian communities or organizations might be dismissive or judgmental of their difficult experiences. And unfortunately, I think this is the case because I've heard a lot of stories. In my private practice, I see mostly Christian leaders and clergy, and I've just like you all, I've heard it all. The darndest things that come out of the mouths of Christian leaders and congregations to their leaders, it's mind-boggling and very hurtful. And I don't blame a lot of us for not wanting to share if we're going to get responses like that. Just wanted to pause to see if there are any comments, reflections here, or questions here. And looking at our time, we have about 5 more minutes. So if we do need a few minutes to close, we can transition to that as well.
There's time for a couple more questions
Okay.
or comments.
I'll tee you off for one, Dave, that may be more appropriate for closing, but I've heard a few kind of take homes for clergy that might be struggling a bit, or for peers of people here that might be struggling. Things like trying to find ways to cultivate humility. You kind of hit on the loneliness, which has gotten quite a bit of attention in what I've seen about clergy burnout. Do you have any other tips, things that active clergy can do to kind of help protect themselves, help support their colleagues? Is there any other kind of practical ideas you can share? And maybe it's as simple as get a counselor, find a David Wang nearby that you can have a trusted individual to support you.
You know, I think, especially with that point about isolation, social isolation, and not having a place to be vulnerable, I think the first place I would start would be, if need be, look outside. I know it's sad, but if need be, look outside the church for someone that is safe to be vulnerable with, and I would also still, suspect that there might be pockets of people, even in more toxic churches. Of course, we're not talking about any of the churches we pastor in, but there still will be oftentimes safe and supportive and understanding individuals in our congregation. You don't have to be vulnerable with everyone. You only need to be vulnerable with maybe 1 or 2 or 3 individuals, and being able to know when to hold your cards, and just having 1 or 2 or 3 contexts where you don't have to do that can really make a huge difference. I think a lot of this in my clinical practice as well has to do with not just what like the expectations that others impose on Christian leaders, but a lot of it also is internalized. We place a lot of unrealistic expectations on ourselves, and so a lot of the work that I end up doing, it ends up being self-compassion work, and we as ministers, we tend to be very compassionate and empathetic people. We can be attuned to other people's suffering, but we're not very attuned to our own suffering. We tend to be very judgmental about ourselves, and we tend to pile it on ourselves. So self-compassion is another huge implication. And another potential implication is doing things that you enjoy, having hobbies that are not productive. So a lot of times people will squeeze in some vacation time, but on a work trip or on a ministry trip, we feel like we have to justify our leisure even through the lens of productivity. And the whole definition of a hobby is that I'm doing it really just because I enjoy doing it and no other reason. It's not supposed to be productive, and we're finding that a lot of Christian leaders used to have that, but we don't have time for that anymore. Because I understand stewardship and stuff like that, but I actually feel like having a balance between work and life is very much a matter of stewardship and longevity as well.
We probably have time for one more question or comment? Or a comment of appreciation? Well, then I'll make a comment of appreciation. Thank you so much, Dr. Wang, for sharing with us. It is important to know, and it's also hard to hear, but it's important to know. So thank you very much. Drew, do you want to say a little bit about what next week's webinar will include?
Sure. So next week, we've got representatives of 3 different programs in churches that are working to address mental health, both for the congregation and the community. So we have a clinical psychologist in Ohio that is working in predominantly Black churches. We have a social worker at the University of Michigan who's partnering with rural churches on an innovative program. You're all signed up for our weekly newsletter at Science for the Church. I have interviewed her in what's coming up next Tuesday in the newsletter. So you'll get a preview of her work in that newsletter. And then Susan Jennings at a PCUSA church in Grand Rapids, who's here with us today, she's going to tell us a little bit about the mental health panel that her church created to meet some of the needs within the congregation and the community. So we're going to really get practical on what are some things our local churches can do to meet the needs within our congregations and in our community. So it'll be 3 different presenters that hopefully will give you some models and ideas that you can translate into your own context.
Great, so we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much. And you've got 1 extra minute for your day. So God bless you.
Blessings to you all. Thanks for being a part of this.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.